Good morning.
Good morning.
On this day that many people are celebrating rebirth, this is a concept that I find helps me feel reborn when I focus on it. So, one of the things I love about ethical culture is that it's very diverse and varied as a philosophy, as a way of life. And different aspects of it appeal to different people. Some, like myself, most embraced deed before creed in our lives. Some prefer emphasizing ethical relationships that we try to build. Some prefer to focus more on the emotive aspects of being an ethical culturist in order to cultivate our empathy for others, for holding other people in our hearts, so that we can support them in their growth as ethical human beings. That's certainly what means the most to me as far as my connection to ethical humanism. But today, I want to focus on rationalism. Ethical culture was very influenced by rationalism. It is part of a humanist movement that's dedicated to reason and is skeptical of blind passion and superstition and magical thinking. And some may not share that love of rationalism. Some people feel it's more uninspiring. But I want to focus on this particular insight that flows from the rational tradition in philosophy. It feeds not into my faith in deed before creed. It doesn't help me nurture my empathy for others. It is rational. And what I mean by rational is not the dry, abstract logic or the esoteric language of academic philosophy. What I mean by this piece of rationality is an awareness. An awareness. It's almost an awareness that's mundane and obvious. We can take it for granted. It's simply the realization that other people are conscious creatures like ourselves, with lives full of pain and pleasure and suffering and joy. So I'm going to explore what I call the moral insight, especially its links to rationalism. I'm going to touch on René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, Josiah Royce, some existentialists, Martin Luther King. So strap on your thinking caps. But I'm going to start with a mundane example. Something that we probably all experience pretty regularly. Imagine that you're hurrying home on a cold, gray afternoon. Maybe it's raining a little bit. Maybe you're late for an appointment. You're all wrapped up in your coat and in your plans and in yourself. You probably are even texting at the same time. And then you notice in front of you what appears to be a person lying on a steam grate, maybe one of the many homeless citizens that we all tend to ignore most of the time. And as you start to move around them, they turn and they sit up. And for some reason, you don't avert your gaze and your eyes meet. And then like a flash, they're transformed in your consciousness from a bundle of soiled and dirty rags to a human being. Their humanity is suddenly before you, and it strikes like a light, profound and humbling in its power. Eye contact is a powerful thing. It animates romantic poems. It helps us navigate the social world. It can be used to control. I remember a particular peace-building workshop that I attended, it must have been 20 years ago. And the instructor said that we were going to find a partner and then look into each other's eyes for 60 seconds. And I thought, 60 seconds, no problem. But when this older woman stepped up as my partner and we began the exercise, I found it surprisingly intense and powerful. Thoughts ran through my mind, like, what is she thinking? Am I invading her space? What does she see in me? And I had this flurry of emotions as well. Doubt, intimacy, curiosity, embarrassment, and fear. Fear that I was intruding on her space, and fear that I would be exposed. I was impressed by the experience, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. Now, I'm not going to go into the psychological studies and the details about a chemical called phenylethylamine, or something like that, that's released into your bloodstream when you look into somebody's eyes for a prolonged period of time. I'm not going to reduce love at first sight to chemistry. But there's a lot of science about this. And there's a lot in literature. Victor Hugo points out that the power of a glance has been so much abused in love stories that it has become to be disbelieved in. Few people dare now say that two people have fallen in love because they've looked at each other. Yet, it is in this way that love begins, and in this way only. But there is a dark side to eye contact. Like when we enter a room, maybe awkwardly, or maybe in an inappropriate mood, like when you come into a board meeting or a company meeting with your smile on, and unbeknownst to you, the boss has just told everybody about their layoffs, and you're smiling. And almost instinctively, you look down and you shuffle off to the side to try to blend in and not be observed. And you dare not look at anybody because you are so aware then that looks can kill. So the human look is a powerful thing. Leave it to brooding Jean-Paul Sartre to come up with an entire thesis on this in his light little tome, Being in Nothingness. He wrote of something that he called the look. He describes an incident. Imagine that you're looking through a keyhole, engrossed in what the person on the other side of the door is doing. You are turning them into an object of your thought. You are the subjective voyeur. And all of a sudden you hear a noise and you realize that a third person is looking at you. You're caught. At that moment, you suddenly change from being a subject looking to an object perceived. You blush and you stammer, and maybe you make up some excuse about having dropped something by the drawer, and you skulk off trying to escape the look. For Sartre, the look is a form of appropriation. It takes a subjective and autonomous person and turns them into an object. And it does so with force. Anybody caught by the look is taken in by the perceiver, almost into an intimate relationship, without the social niceties that offer the comfortable distance that we have from one another. Sartre writes in his book that the look becomes, quote, present. People become present to the eyes without distance. It's that intimate. Now, in my recent work in trying to understand the Me Too movement, which was started primarily due to lecherous male behavior, I think about how often men use the look to intimidate and manipulate women. How common it is for wandering eyes of men to turn women into objects, intentionally or unintentionally. It happens all the time. It's an objectification of women constantly reinforced through the overemphasis on the physical body in our media and our culture at the expense of the whole person. So it's important to keep in mind how the look can have very different effects. But when the look is mutual, when there's no manipulation or attempt to control, it reminds the individuals involved of their shared essential humanity. And I think of this when I read the writings of the 19th century philosopher Josiah Royce, who I taught years ago. Taught his work, not him. Royce didn't really speak of eye contact, but I think about eye contact when I read his work, especially the essay called The Moral Insight. It's an insight that punctuates our lives. Sometimes it's at the surface, and other times it fades down into the subconscious because we're engaged in immediate concerns. Royce urges us to consider our brothers and sisters in the human race. He says, take whatever thou knowest or desirest of striving, of burning love, of fierce hatred, realize as fully as thou canst what that means, and then with clear certainty add, such as it is for me, so it is for him, nothing less. Now Royce distinguishes this insight from emotion. He says, what we now ask of thee is no sentiment, no gush of pity, no tremulous weakness of sympathy, but a calm, clear insight. Pain is pain, joy is joy, everywhere, even as in thee. Pain is pain, joy is joy, in everybody, you, me, everyone we see. Is that something for you that's obvious? Is it trivial? Or is it important? Contemplate yourself for a moment. Turn in and just imagine your own life, all of your memories, your joys, your hopes, your concerns, your first kiss, the birth of a baby, the death of a parent, all the anger and joy and frustration and fear and love. And imagine that for all 6 billion plus people on the planet, that is true for them too. When I bring that before me, it's miraculous. It's an amazing insight. Royce says that this insight ends the illusion of selfishness. He says, the realization of one's neighbor is the resolution to treat him or her as if he were real. That is, to treat him unselfishly. It kind of reminds me of what happens in my head when I walk by a homeless person on the street. When our eyes meet, it breaks my stride. It leads me to reach into my pocket and give $1 or $2, which is a totally inadequate acknowledgement of our shared humanity. But it is an acknowledgement of that shared humanity. It's trying to say, almost just symbolically, I see you, I care, I hope things are better for you. You are a unique person in an interconnected world. So we're all unique. That's true. Royce says, so far as we live and strive at all, our lives are various and needed for the whole. And we are unique. End quote. Which is why probably this talk will strike you all very differently. And that's fine. I get very excited about the rational element of this. In some ways, as I said, this insight is obvious and it's mundane. But what's intriguing to me, central to the way Royce talks about it, is that it doesn't involve emotion or empathy or fellow feeling. Instead, it's about a realization, an awareness, a truth, if you will. It's not, as he said, about sentiment or pity or sympathy, but a calm, clear insight. And that aspect of the moral insight connects to the rationalism that I find in our tradition. Now, most simply stated, the rational tradition in philosophy proposes that the best avenue to truth is through reason. Now, rationalists don't appeal to the senses for truth because they think that the senses can deceive. They don't rely on emotions because they think emotions can deceive as well. Sentiment can convince us to see things that aren't really there because we want to see them. So rationalists say we can't rely on that. They rely on what they call the clear light of reason. And they often do so through the metaphor of light, like during the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. There is a connection. Through intellectual principles, rational philosophers have connected to truth in each other. Plato spoke of the light in terms of the forms, intellectual objects, eternal and perfect in nature. Descartes trusted the, quote, light of reason to overcome the illusions of the world. Stoic philosophers spoke of a spark of divine reason, is the wording they used. John Locke called reason the candle of the Lord. Now, when Immanuel Kant started his rigorous process to try to explain consciousness, he suggested that within the mind there are 12 pure categories of understanding, such as relation, limitation, universality, negation, and he said that these concepts must exist in order for us to have experience at all. You don't get them from experience, you have to have them to have experience. But he also suggested that there are 2 elements that were even more fundamental, and they were the pure, absolute intuitions of time and space. These pure intuitions, as he called them, are what allow us to have experience because it's within time and space that we have experiences. And if we didn't have those, we wouldn't be able to have experience to begin with. If they weren't loaded into our software at birth, the computer wouldn't run. So why am I taking you down this rationalist rabbit hole right now? The reason is because I think that the rationalist tradition, as touched on by Kant, who influenced Adler, there is a faith that truth can be apprehended or analyzed directly. Whether Kant or other rationalists were right or wrong in this is not the focus today. What strikes me as intriguing and I want to pull out today is the belief that direct and immediate apprehension of truths can strike us powerfully and can settle into the foundations of our thought. For Kant, the power of reason reflected his deep respect for people, for consciousness. And I think that it's part of his deepest moral commitment, his belief that every human being is worthy of respect, simply for being a human, rational, conscious creature. Every person, he explained, should be treated as an end in itself, never merely as a mean. We can't just use people as a tool and then throw them out. And for this, Kant said it was self-evident. He used the term, it proves itself to reason. It proves itself to reason. For Plato, the forms prove themselves to reason. So when Plato talked about a circle drawn on a chalkboard, he said, we all know that that's not a perfect circle, because perfect circles only exist in the mind. And the mind has the ideal circle that we apprehend directly and helps us understand the drawn circle. It proves itself to reason just like Descartes believed the Archimedean point of his entire philosophy, the cogito, I think therefore I am, proves itself to reason. He said you don't need evidence for it. It is rationally clear. It's a logical existential truth. And it's about being human. So rationalism's faith in truth that prove themselves to reason, unmediated by the senses, arise in the writings of Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, was this idealistic phrasing just a way to allow him to push aside the ugly realities of being a slave owner? Perhaps, but that's another talk. But what I'm focusing on today is the self-evidence of that rational proposition. Jefferson talks about these rights being unalienable. Enlightenment philosophers talked about them as well as being fundamental to the person. Inherent in their very existence is a right-bearing quality, is what they call it. It can't be stripped away. It can't be made alien to any of us. It is unalienable. It's part of our very identity and essence. What does it mean to be self-evident? For me, 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident. Perhaps it's a tautological truth. But it stands on its own. It's as clear as can be. It doesn't matter if I want 2 + 2 = 4 or not. It compels me, rationally, to accept it. For me, so too does the moral insight. The spark of consciousness that is within each human being feels to me self-evident. That it strikes me in a flash like a rational truth. Josiah Royce said that his greatest aim in life was to help other people experience the moral insight as often as possible. For me, the moral insight helps me honor the inherent worth of every person. The reality is, though, it can fade. All insights fade with time. And Royce talks poignantly about how aware he is that the moral insight, his resolution to treat people with respect, fades. He says, this resolution expresses and belongs to the moment of insight. Passion may cloud the insight the very next moment. It always does cloud the insight after no very long time. We go back to daily action. We feel the heat of hereditary passions. We straightaway forget what we have seen. Our neighbor becomes obscure. He is once more a foreign power. He is unreal. We are again deluded and selfish. This conflict goes on and will go on as long as we live. Moments of insight with their accompanying resolutions, long stretches of delusion and selfishness. This is our life. So why does it fade? I mean, it fades in part because we're afraid. We're afraid that if we really opened ourselves to the reality of 6 billion people having experiences like us, that we would be overwhelmed. Adler calls it a spiritual pain in a section that I quote so often you probably can speak back to me. We stand, as it were, on the shore and see multitudes of our fellow beings struggling in the water, stretching forth their arms, sinking, drowning, and we are powerless to assist them. It's so hard to be open to the moral insight. The experience of suffering builds, quote, a prison around us, Adler says. I feel it around me often. But the moral insight fades also because of mundane reasons that people can be annoying. And it can lead us to dehumanize or to treat people cheaply. We can blame. But Adler counsels against both those reactions. He says, despite our experience of fading, this insight fading, that we need to hold on to something like the moral insight. He says if we do, excuse the theistic language, he says if we do, we shall learn to see and know the human being with whom we come in contact from a new point of view, regarding them as masks behind which divinity lurks, as revealers of hidden spiritual possibilities. We shall attribute a certain greatness and sacredness to them, and the cheapness that now so often marks our estimate of those with whom we are familiar, vulgarizing human intercourse, will disappear. Behind that mask lies divinity for Adler, that spark, that insight. In The Religion of Duty, Adler uses the metaphor of a gold mine. He says, we are all like people on the surface. We're divided off. We have our little yards and our fences, and everybody's got their own plot. But underneath where the gold exists, it's all the same. We just have to dig under the surface to get there. One person that dug under the surface that I like to go to for gold is Martin Luther King Jr. You won't find him in any dictionary of rationalist philosophy, but there are rationalist elements in his thinking. He was a big fan of Immanuel Kant. As a child, I was drawn, as I know many of you were, emotionally to Martin Luther King, to his work, and certainly to the crushing sacrifice for what is right. But he spoke of eternal truths, truths accessible by something different than emotion. He promoted a type of love that was universal, that implied a rational duty. In one speech of October 1667 called, Where Do We Go From Here?, King distinguishes sentimental, emotional love from a rational, universal love. He said, I know that love ultimately is the only answer to mankind's problem. I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about a strong, demanding love. This wasn't a love for a particular person by a particular person. It was a universal love that, at least to me, proves itself to reason. But for any insight to affect us, we do have to embrace them. We can't call it fake news. We have to accept what a demanding love asks us to do. We have to accept the moral insight, that flash that strikes us. And we have to transform it into action through choice. Like King, we have to conclude simply, I have decided to love. He didn't fall into the love that was his life. He decided to love. He accepted the insight. I'm going to end with some quotes by Carter Hayward, a theologian. She says, love does not just happen. We are not love machines, puppets on the strings of a deity called love. Love is a choice. Not simply or necessarily a rational choice, although I say, I think it is too. But rather a willingness to be present to others without pretense or guile. Love is a conversation to humanity, a conversion, a willingness to participate with others in the healing of a broken world and broken lives. Love is the choice to experience life as a member of the human family, a partner in the dance of life. rather than an alien in the world or as a deity above the world, aloof and apart from human flesh. For all I've said about how I think the moral insight is obvious, for all the self-evidence I think it carries, we do have to decide to love. It's not a sentimental love. It's not emotional bosh. It's more like 2 + 2 = 4. It's not a truth that's up to us to declare. It's inherent in the experience of the moral insight. Albert Camus, who lived in a world where fascism had turned so many people away from love, wrote his novel The Plague. And in The Plague, he appealed to truth to change the world. He said, "There always comes a time in history when the person who dares to say that 2 + 2 = 4 is punished with death. And the issue is not what reward or punishment will be the outcome of that reasoning. The issue is whether or not 2 + 2 = 4. So in the end, it's up to us to choose to embrace the moral insight, or not, to bury it in our daily busyness, or we can choose to hold it up as often as we can so we can lead more ethical lives. Hayward writes, "Love is not fundamentally a sweet feeling, not at heart a matter of sentiment, attachment, or being drawn towards. Love is active, effective, a matter of making reciprocal and mutually beneficial relation with one's friends and enemies. Love creates righteousness or justice here on earth." And as an ethical humanist dedicated to deep before creed, the moral insight helps me move closer to my ideals. I'm deeply grateful for this simple, profound, and powerful moral insight. Thank you very much.